Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we will tackle the German victory in the West, and in particular over France in 1940. Even though it's been partly overshadowed by later events in the war, at the time it was rightly seen as one of the greatest military victories of all time. It was a short but decisive campaign, and is still the source of all sorts of misunderstandings and controversy. And Jesse, I know that this is a campaign which is very close to your heart because you've got a fable, you might say, for all things French. So I think this is the right episode for you. So just talk us through the situation in and before 1940 and what led to this particular campaign.
Indeed, I have to say, Matthias, that I might get emotional over the course of this episode at some point because, working in public history, in English, online, there's a lot of very interesting and some not so interesting discussion about France in the Second World War. And we will try to break it down. We'll try to get into some of those mysteries, some of those misunderstandings, some of those controversies about the war. Where's there a grain of truth, and where has the sort of cheese-eating surrender monkeys meme gotten out of control? And yes, I did live in France for a while, but I think I can still approach it with some degree of reason. But yes, let us begin the story roundabout in spring 1940. We're well into the so-called phony war, right? The Sitzkrieg, la drôle de guerre. Nothing much has happened in the World War II sense, let's say, over the course of the winter of 1939-1940. But then things start to get going in terms of military operations again after the Polish campaign in April, because Germany invades Denmark and then invades Norway. Now, the British and French do send troops to Norway to try to counter the Germans, but the Germans are getting the upper hand and they've conquered most of the country by the time this famous or infamous case yellow, Fall Gelb, I was about to say, begins. And that is the German invasion of the Low Countries and France. Now, each side has had time to plan. And the plans are part of the drama that surrounds the story of this victory. So why don't we get into the German side of the planning? I mean, they're the ones who eventually have the success, but the planning process for them is a little bit messy.
It's not just a little bit messy, but it's extremely messy, you might say. And probably one of the main reasons for this is that when you think about Hitler, his ideas, his ideology, this is not really a campaign he wants to fight, because he wants to fight and he wants to have a free hand in the East. It's all about the living space. So no doubt we'll tackle all these things in future episodes. But he is slightly confused, and everyone else is very confused in the German High Command when in 1939, on the 3rd of September, the Western Allies, France and the UK, declare war on Germany. And there are accounts that Hitler basically has a nervous breakdown and said, how are we going to do this? Because, well, this is not what I want. I didn't expect these weak democracies to stand up and fight. So really confusing. And everything that happens after the Poland campaign up to 1941, so the final invasion of the Soviet Union, you might say is a bit of a detour for Hitler. And this is very, very much obvious in the planning for the campaign itself. So the campaign against Poland is over very, very quickly, and it takes a few weeks. And Hitler then is overambitious. He just thinks, you know what, we've done this, that was a walkover, so we should do exactly the same thing now, and let's move against France in the autumn of 1939. All the alarm bells go off in the German High Command for a number of reasons. The first one, of course, it's completely the wrong period. So the bad weather period has started and will only get worse, which is not good if you want to have modern combined arms warfare. And also, these guys all still have the experience of World War I, trench warfare, 4 years of fighting on the Western Front. So they are actually not convinced that they can win this. So the only trump that the Germans have at that particular point, comparing the situation in 1940 to perhaps 1914, is, of course, that this time they're not facing a two-front war. They have defeated Poland and they have an alliance with the Soviet Union. But still, people don't really think that they can win this. And so when you look at the original plans from the German side, this is very much resembled, because the first plan that is drawn up and presented to Hitler, that's on the 19th of October in 1939, so not 2 weeks after the end of the Polish campaign. And so the OKH, the Supreme Commander of the Army, presents this plan to Hitler. Apparently, he has a fit and he shouts out, well, this is the Schlieffen plan all along. So the 1914 plan, which had failed. And it is true, because the planning of the German High Command at that particular stage was very much, we go into Belgium, we occupy Belgium, we're probably going to have some sort of trench warfare, we're going to muddle through, maybe we're going to win, maybe not. So Hitler sends them back to the drawing board, and they come up with a number of other plans. So they're all not particularly exciting. They're all a little bit like the Schlieffen plan with some adaptations. And one person who's particularly unhappy with this is a chap called Erich von Manstein, who has been called the most able of German generals of the Second World War. That's a quote by Little Hart. So he was very much an operational thinker. And of course, he had also served in the First World War on the Western Front. So he knew the terrain, he understood what everything looks like. And he at that stage is the chief of the General Staff of Army Group A. And he comes up with, at that stage, an early version of what later on becomes known, it's a word by Churchill, the famous sickle cut, which we will explore in a bit more detail later on. The problem with this is that the more senior generals, they don't like the idea, because they think it's too daring, it's too bold. If this goes wrong, we're going to fail. So the OKH, Helder, for example, chief of the general staff, they all say, you know what, that's not going to happen. And as a consequence, they post him. They sack him as the chief of staff of this army group, and they give him a corps command somewhere in East Prussia. So you can't be further away from where the action is going to be than that. So it's basically like the Siberia of Germany at that time. And he sits then, of course, he feels very angry and does whatever he does in East Prussia. But then something else happens. That's quite interesting, and that changes the entire dynamic. And that's the famous Mechelen incident. So the 10th of January 1940, a German major, he's 52 years old, he's the commander of an airfield, Loddenheide, which is the airfield in those days of my home city, Münster. So he meets someone in the officers' mess the night before. And this guy, he's also an Air Force person, and he's supposed to take the train the next day from Münster to Cologne for a war game. And he's got all the secret documents, mainly Air Force documents, with him. The other guy says, you know what, I need some flying experience, some flying hours anyway. Apparently, so the story goes, he also wants to take some laundry to Cologne. I've got no idea whether that's true or not. Why would you do that? But there we are. He said, you know what, the next morning I'll fly you to Cologne. They jump in the plane on the 10th of January. They set off. And if you haven't been to Cologne, it's a very big city. It's right on the banks of the River Rhine. It has the largest cathedral north of the Alps. It's very, very difficult to miss. However, they somehow manage to miss Cologne, and they fly around. Then there's a problem with the plane. They land, basically, you might say, slightly flippantly, to ask for directions. And it's only when they encounter the Belgian Home Guard, they realize, oh my God, something's gone seriously wrong. So they then try to burn the documents, the secret documents. It doesn't work. And so the Allies get their hands on this particular plan. The Germans learn about this, and there's an emergency meeting. And Jodl, the chief of the operations section of the OKW, writes in his diary that particular day, well, if the Allies, the Western Allies, have got all the plans, this is a catastrophe, and we need to change the plan. And that's exactly what Hitler says. You know what? We can't do this. He's then briefed that this rather random German officer called Manstein, who wasn't famous at the time at all, has come up with a slightly different plan. And maybe that's the way forward. And he said, okay, let's listen to that. And on the 17th of February, Hitler convenes a conference. So Manstein is there, and Manstein presents his famous sickle cut plan. And Hitler says, you know what? Let's go for and with this. This is daring. This is bold. This is new. It's not the Schlieffen plan. Let's do it. And on the 18th of February, they finally adopt that plan. Still a little bit of change happens from there until the operation is really then launched in May. But this is basically the genesis of this really, really confusing planning on the German side. I know that the Western Allies, of course, also have their plan, and we'll explore the interrelationship a little bit later. But just talk us through the Allied, in particular, you might say, the French plan.
Yeah, well, it's not a whole lot more organized, let's say, or thought through in some senses on the Allied side. One of the things that struck me as I've been reading about the German planning, though, before I move into the Allies, is I think the latest count is that there was something like 29 delays in launching Case Yellow due to all sorts of different factors, sometimes weather, because Hitler originally wanted them to go in November 1939, but there's all these delays, and then of course, as you mentioned, these power struggles, these different interpretations of how it should be done, and in the end, a tweaked version, let's say a slightly weakened version of Manstein's so-called sickle cut plan gets adopted after all the mishaps that you summarize. So, what are the French doing? Now, we have to remember there's a good reason that the German generals, that some of them are cautious. It might sound strange. It might sound strange to us now to think, oh, why were the German generals so cautious? I mean, of course, they walked through the French and everybody knows that, but hindsight is always 2020. The French army was still considered by most to be the best in the world at the time. That might be I might be slightly optimistic on that, but there's no question that no one expected that Germany would walk through France like it did. So it makes sense that they would show a degree of caution. Those German commanders know the weaknesses of their own institution, of their own army, that it's not really ready for what they expect France to be able to do, reasonably expect France to be able to do. But as we know, Allied plans are in even worse shape than the German plans. To summarize things here, they end up adopting a sort of a cautious but risky, if I can combine those two, plan that they call Plan D. It's based on moving into the neutral countries of Belgium and Holland if Germany, as expected, invades through those two countries. Start cooperating with the Dutch and Belgians, and then hold the Germans as best they can, starting with a line on the Dial River in Belgium. Also part of the Albert Canal, also using some forts, like a famous fort called Eben Emael, which ends up holding out for one day. No offense to the Belgians among you. Unfortunately, the fort only held out for one day in the end. This plan is a disaster for several reasons. First of all, the Belgians and Dutch are neutral, so they don't want to anger the Germans. They don't want to compromise that neutrality, so they don't really engage in serious coordinated planning with the British and French. So right there, you're going into a bit of a void. You're going to make it up as you go along, the details of coordinating hundreds of thousands of men taking up positions in these two countries. In addition, the hinge of that line, of course, you have the Maginot Line, the famous French Maginot Line defending the Franco-German border. That's why the Germans are going to go through Belgium again. The hinge of that line is the Ardennes Forest. Now, it's very famous because of the Battle of the Bulge, which happens later in the war. But its first sort of entrance onto the main stage in World War II is in May 1940, because that's a very thinly defended area. It's thickly forested. So the French sort of figure the Germans are probably not going to be able to launch a major operation through the forest, even though French intelligence warned the high command that that part of the line was held too thinly. And finally, another element of risks that the Allies, and the French in particular, are taking is that one army, I believe it was the 7th, if memory serves, 7th French Army, was initially planned to be used as a reserve, but instead it gets assigned to march into Holland towards the town of Breda. So now you've also gambled away your safety margin with the reserve army. So the Allies are actually in worse shape planning-wise than the Germans.
And when you take it back very, very briefly again to what you talked about, so the French army and the view of the French army. So you're absolutely right. The Germans still thought, like everybody else, that this is one of the best armies in the world. And again, we mustn't forget that their frame of reference is the First World War. And in World War I, the Germans regarded the French army as the best army on the Western Front. It is interesting when you look at innovation, for example, that the British army comes in, and lots of stuff has been written about innovation in the British army. When you look at the German documents, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, they think that the Brits got these ideas from the French because they see the French army as the best army on the other side. I think that's very important. The same, you talked about the Belgians and the Dutch, the same thing. So let's not forget the Netherlands. It was a neutral country in the First World War, and actually always very, very pro-German. So you might say, well, poor Dutch people, they really didn't deserve to be invaded by the Germans, you might say. That's very unfortunate. And when you look at the 10th of May 1940, when the invasion in the West finally does happen, you talked about all the delays and we talked about the different plans. The first phase looks exactly like the original German plan, because the Germans have got 3 army groups that they send in from north to south, confusingly called Army Group B, then A, and then C. ABC would have been too easy. And B goes in first. And these are the guys that go into Belgium, into the Netherlands. And these are very light forces, mainly infantry, a lot of airborne. You already talked about Email. Our listeners, if you haven't been there, go there, have a look. It's an absolutely fascinating site. It's the first time that hollow charges were used in the war by the Germans. It was a state secret at the time. It's a fascinating little tactical story. So when this happens, the Allies think, oh, look at this. The plan that we got because of the Mechelen incident, well, the Germans are sticking to it, which sets in motion the French and the Allied plan. Again, we'll return to that in a bit more detail later on. But at that stage, the Germans then also launch the main thrust, and this is through the Ardennes. You already talked about it. The Ardennes is a very hilly terrain. In 1940, you've only got a handful of roads that go from west to east, and the Germans are pushing the strongest, the largest army group through this forest. So the sources tell us that there was a traffic jam, if you put all the jams together, of around 500 kilometers. So if the French had perhaps just one spotter plane in the air, had seen what was going on, the German plan would have collapsed. So this really is taking a risk. This is as daring as it gets. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. As we know, this time it really does work. And you already talked about the crucial point, the hinge. And that really is the place called Sedan, which is a fascinating place in European military history, because there's all sorts of stuff happening there. If you want to understand, in particular, German-French military relations, you just need to go to Sedan, because there is fighting there in 1870, 71. The French emperor surrenders there. You've got fighting there in particular in 1918. That's the Americans against the Germans. Then, of course, you've got 1940. And then, of course, you already mentioned it, you've got the Battle of the Bulge. There's all sorts of stuff happening because the terrain really lends itself to it. Because once you've crossed the River Meuse at that particular point, you have relatively flat, open terrain and country in front of you if you're driving west. And that's, of course, exactly what the Germans want to do. And in order to achieve the breakthrough at this crucial point, the Germans concentrate an awful lot of man and troops, man and material in that area. So when the Germans arrive at Sedan, this is 30 Corps under the very famous German General Guderian. He has got 3 tank divisions, the 2nd, the 1st, and the 10th Panzer Division under his command. And when you look at the map, these get deployed on a front line of roughly 10 kilometers. And along these 10 kilometers, the German concentrate 1/3 of the iron fist that they have, and that's the tank force. So this really is a sheer concentration of force that the Germans achieve. And it's not only this, but they've got other things as well. To support the crossing of the river, the Germans achieved the highest concentration of aircraft during the entire war. Not a lot of people talk about this, but never again do the Germans achieve that. You also have an awful lot of, for example, anti-air, because they build pontoon bridges, and of course they know that they need to protect these. So the Allies, both the British and the French, they try to destroy them. They launch a number of air raids, and these have casualty rates of around about 56 to 62%. So that's absolutely awful. And they managed to damage 3 bridges, but that is pretty much it. So the British attack that comes in, to give one example, has 71 bombers, 44 of these are lost. So that's really a very, very heavy blood loss, because the Germans understand the importance of this. The Germans manage to cross the river. They start rolling up the position, because it's also the end of the Maginot Line. So another reason why it's good to attack here. And what you then have is really fascinating, because it really shows you also the different doctrine, the different ethos behind that. To the south of Sedan, you've got some heights. And the Germans, having war-gamed this and having looked at this, know how important these heights are, because that is absolutely crucial terrain. You hold this, you control the entire, let's call it salient for a better term, the entire bend of the River Meuse in the Sedan area. It takes the Germans 45 minutes to drive forward and to occupy these heights. The French, on the other hand, just played through the same scenario in a war game a few months ago, They know exactly what they need to do. But because they haven't got written orders, they are not willing to launch their core reserve, which is the 7th Tank Battalion, to push them forward. And by the time they finally get that written order, it has taken them 15 hours. By that stage, the Germans are dug in and they can repulse the attack. Subsequent attacks, for example, in a place called Strohn, which changes hands several times during a very, very heavy fighting, is already too late, already proves fruitless, because the Germans have controlled the heights, or they are controlling the heights. They have managed to cross the river. And once this is all done, they're then able to break out, to push west, and a very, very swift campaign across the First World War battlefields of the Somme. They then manage to reach the Channel only a few days later.
Right. So now we've sunk our teeth into why the Germans are having the success that they have, despite the massive risk, right, that you talked about, of trying to cross the river, going through the forest. If the French had just done a few things differently, it could have gone the other way. If you listeners out there, if you're trying to envision what's happening, just imagine the German tanks are all concentrated, and that's very important. They're concentrated. They have fewer tanks than the British and French do in total, but they have concentrated them. They're using them differently. I think that's something we're going to return to when we talk about the idea of blitzkrieg a little bit later in the episode. But this concentrated German armor group is going to punch right through. So they cut off about 1 million men. By the 20th of May, they reached the English Channel at a place called Abbeville. Rommel's division is involved in that advance, and they cut off in Belgium and northern France about 1 million British and French troops. And south of that, you basically have the River Somme of World War I fame that kind of becomes the southern front line. The French are too slow to react. I think that's one of the major issues that they have. It's something, I mean, the reasons for the defeat we'll return to, I think, towards the end of the episode, because there's all sorts of different accusations and explanations and interpretations and so on. But I think one incontrovertible fact is that they react too slowly. There's even a quote from a French general that I came across who's captured by the Germans, and he says, "You're just faster than us. That's what's happening. You're just too fast. We cannot react to you." They start crossing the Meuse on May 13th, and they're already on the Channel by May 20th. I mean, this is far faster than the French were able to deal with the type of army, the type of command system, the type of army culture that they had at the time. There are, though, a couple of, let's say, redeeming moments for the French. You mentioned one of them at Ston, a village called Ston, where the French launch a counterattack. And there's one standout action there by a man called, he's a captain in the French army, Pierre Biot. His father's actually a general at this time, but he's in one of the heavier French tanks, the Char B1 bis, as it's called. And he alone, well, his crew and him alone, take out 13 German tanks, because the German tanks are lighter and more lightly armed than the French ones. And so in a confined space in that village, he's able to just wreak havoc. And they hit his tank many, many dozens of times, I think over 100 times, but aren't able to kill it. And he takes them out. So that's a tantalizing example of some things that might have happened more often. There's also another major tank battle at a place called Anu, where you have several hundred tanks on both sides involved. The Germans do get the better of the French there. But there are things happening. It's not just the question of the French fleeing, although some units are already showing signs of disorganization, demoralization. Some of them retreat without fighting, and some of them surrender as well. That's going to accelerate in the next phase of the battle. But let's take a pause, and I'm choosing that word on purpose here because it's important and will come up again. But let's take a pause and talk about what happens next after this initial breakthrough, and you have the BEF and a couple 100,000 French troops trapped in what will become the Dunkirk pocket.
Before we talk about this, very, very briefly, coming back to the points that you mentioned, you're absolutely right. So the Germans are just faster. The French are actually fighting much more than people give them credit for. So there's, as you already explained, a lot of very heroic tactical actions on the French side. But from the operational, the bigger picture point of view, they are just, as you said, they are just too slow. It all boils down to things like mission command, which is one of the reasons why this particular campaign is still being taught in military academies around the world today. I don't know how many lectures I've given on France 1940 to military audiences. I've stopped counting the number of staff rides I've been on, exploring exactly this. How can an army that's actually weaker, the German army, how can this army defeat a much, much stronger, numerically superior coalition of enemies? And all boils down to the different components of fighting power, of which the material is only one. There's also morale and there's the conceptual. And that's where the Germans have the upper hand. And that's really what wins the battles, the fights, and also the campaign for them. When you look at the numbers, you already mentioned them. So the Germans have got far less troops, particularly when you look, for example, at guns. That is, to me, always the most striking example. I'm an artilleryman myself, so I always find that very interesting. I know it's a bit sad, big bangs and booms, but there we are. So the Germans have around 7,000 guns, roughly speaking, slightly over 7,000, whereas the French alone have 14,000. Why is that? Because they want to largely refight the First World War. The First World War was the war of the gunner. And the First World War, you didn't have to be particularly quick and fast. You just had to be methodical. And also you had to be very strong in the last and final push, which is one of the reasons why the Allies, particularly the French, hold back a large reserve of their air force, for example. So you can see these two different ideas completely clashing. And as you said, we return to this when we talk about the blitzkrieg concept and other things later on. So, but coming back to your point, say the Allies are now in the bag. Before the Germans actually have them in the bag, the Germans actually get worried because everything is too successful. So the advancing troops are stopped. And Guderian is told, well, you can't advance with the troops anymore because your tanks are just driving ahead. You've got absolutely no flank protection, which makes the whole thing even more interesting because this campaign was basically won by a handful of German divisions. It's the 10 tank divisions plus a few motorized infantry divisions. Everyone else just marches behind the tanks, is trying to keep up or catch up, and quite often that fails. Perhaps the most famous example is an account by Ernst Jünger. You might know them if you're interested in the First World War, of Storm of Steel fame. He also writes a report in World War II. So he's brought back into the army. He's made a captain in an infantry unit, and he writes another book, perhaps hoping to have another commercial success, just like with Storms of Steel. But actually, it's like a travel diary, because he keeps describing the nice houses, the flora, the fauna, because he hardly sees any action at all. So that makes the whole thing even more interesting. So Guderian is ordered to stop his tank so the infantry can catch up. He then goes back and has a chat with his army group commander and say, okay, what you can do is you can conduct some recce in force because you need to know where the enemy are. So once you start pushing again, that's when you can go. He interprets the order in a completely different way and his entire corps on the march again. So blatantly disobeying the order, you might say. Thankfully it worked. They then, as you said, they reach Abbeville, so the Allies are in the back. It depends on how you look at this. And of course, there are very different views. If you take this as one big pocket, all the Allied troops that are captured now in northern France and Belgium, all these areas, and the ones that are already surrendered, this would make it, one point of view, would make it the biggest pocket in military history. About 1.2 million men in there. That's not how most people see it, because we tend to concentrate very much on one episode, one aspect, and that, of course, is the Dunkirk one, where the Allies are trying to evacuate. Well, I should say the British more than the French. I'll hand that over to you again. You can talk about the French in a minute, because I know it's a very sore subject in France even today. And what then happens is really interesting, because the Germans are very, very close. They're about 20 kilometers away from Dunkirk. And it would be very easy for them to drive in and to basically just take prisoner, destroy, neutralize, defeat the Allied forces there. But then the famous hold order comes into effect. So on the 23rd of May, Guderian is about 20 kilometers away from Dunkirk. On the 24th of May, Hitler flies to the HQ of Army Group A, that's Rundstedt, and he stops the advance. And that is the big myth, the big confusing question, the story about this, which we can talk about in more detail later on when we talk about some of the myths of this particular campaign. But that gives the Allies a little bit of breathing space, which means they can start evacuating an awful lot of troops. It's not as glorious as some certain recent feature films show you or want to tell you. It's still relatively bloody, also for the British. So they lose a number of, in particular, ships. They lose a number of destroyers. A lot of people still get captured. But of course, large parts of the BEF are able to withdraw to the UK. The German bombers fly about 2,000 sorties over Dunkirk. So that all tells you quite a bit about the use of air power. But of course, there's another story to this, and this is returning to the sore thumb, you might say. And that, of course, is the French recollection, the French story of Dunkirk. And I hand back over to our French expert.
Well, thank you. I'm from Quebec, but
it
not
counts. It counts.
But I guess it counts indirectly somehow. Yeah, slightly different accent, but that's another story. So, if you look at things from the French point of view, once the German breakthrough has sort of cut off this northern pocket, the dominoes are really falling, right? So the Dutch have surrendered on the 15th of May, after the horrible bombing of Rotterdam, by the way, which we might return to if we have time later in this episode. The Belgians then decide to surrender suddenly on the 28th of May and open up a gap in the line, which puts that pocket in even more danger, which then the BEF and French are able to close. And then, if we're going to try to use our sense of historical empathy here to understand why the French might feel some of the resentment that they felt at the time against the British, and which has a political impact that hopefully I'll get the chance to talk about in a few minutes. The British are the ones who give the order to evacuate Dunkirk. So they decide, we're going to pull our forces back. They don't ask French permission really for that, even though France is the senior ally. France has far more troops in the field than the British do. And so nowadays, anyway, part of the discussion is, and at the time, I should say also, it was equally controversial at the time, that the British are not fighting hard enough, right? Very often in the English-speaking world, we say the French didn't fight hard enough and we had to save them and so on. We, in quotation marks, of course, since none of us were around at the time. But the French partly felt that way about the British because they decided to evacuate. And the French then are in a bit of a jam because their best troops are in that pocket. And they have to join the fighting retreat. And they end up providing, of course, the rear guard. And nearly 90,000 French troops are not able to be evacuated and are made prisoner after helping to protect the evacuation at Dunkirk. So this is one of the elements of the defeat, I think, of the Allies, is this increasing tension, increasing resentment between the two camps, between the British and the French.
And you can see this being played out as well in the one famous episode where you might say the Allies had the chance to really turn things around. And that is the famous counterattack at Arras on the 21st of May, 1940. So the Germans are advancing, they have reached the Channel, and as you said, the Allies have got their crack troops, the good troops, all in the northern pocket. They're encircled, but they're still operational because they've just been encircled, so they can still do an awful lot of damage. At the same time, you still have French troops to the south of this. And as we know, the Germans were very worried about flank protection. So the original idea that the Allies come up with now is to have a massive attack in the Arras area to cut the German advanced troops off and basically completely turn around the situation, so encircling the German troops. And again, not only any troops, but these are the crack troops. These are the iron fist of the German army. And when you look at how this operation or the tactical action is actually conducted, particularly by the British, you can see that it couldn't really succeed. It's too small, it's only tactical, it's not the big strategic counterattack that they envisaged, because really what you do have is a British division, the 50th, you've got a French division, and you also have the 1st British Tank Brigade that launched an attack which gives the Germans an awful lot of pain. The British managed to overrun a German resupply column, so it's not looking good for the Germans. But then Rommel arrives on the scene and he occupies what is still known today as Rommel Hill, where he orders the troops to conduct a defensive action. He establishes a blocking line, brings forward anti-tank guns, and they basically, in the end, cut a very long story very short, managed to knock out the entire British tank brigade. So all the tanks are lost. So that's the famous counterattack. When you start analyzing it, I mean, you could do a whole episode on it in its own right. I'll just keep it very, very short. So basically, it's a strategic failure. It's an operational blunder. and it's a tactical disaster for the British. This is not how it's normally seen and how it's normally described in the English-speaking world, because obviously it's a very glorious action. But once you start digging in and scratching the surface, you can see that what they did was actually not as well planned and wasn't conducted in a particularly clever way. Coming back to this whole point about mission command, which they didn't use really well. However, there was an after story to this, and this is Rommel again. In the previous episode, we talked a little bit about the Rommel myth, and here it comes out again. He's very much a self-publicist. He's very good at promoting himself. So he reports back up the chain of command that he'd been attacked by hundreds of Allied tanks. And only because of his genius, the Germans prevailed and managed to win the battle. When he sends that back, of course, all the alarm bells go off in the German high command. So many Allied tanks we're not expecting in this area, which again launches the whole debate about stopping the tanks, flank protection, and all these things. So indirectly, in a way, actually there was a positive effect for the Allies, not the way they had intended.
Indeed. I remember hearing quite a bit about the Arras counterattacks because I had the opportunity to live briefly in the town of Arras. And we learned not only about its First World War history, but of course about that much talked about, but not in the end of any particular impact counterattack that took place. The French also launched a small, ineffective tactical level counterattack a little bit after the British did from the southern part of the front, but neither of them were able to break that German salient that is splitting the Allied armies in half. Now, this story, folks, we've taken you up to early June, right? The evacuation at Dunkirk ends June 4th. And then the next phase of the German offensive, which is called Case Red, and which we don't have to go into so much detail about because unfortunately it's a bit of a foregone conclusion in this case, begins on June 5th. And then the whole show ends in the last week of June with the armistice. But there are a few things I do want to point out because this phase of the battle has its own interesting aspects as well, some of them political. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the German war crimes during this campaign, which are not as well known as, of course, the much more massive war crimes that take place in Eastern Europe from 1941 onwards. But they're already showing, as they did in Poland, they're already showing the effects of the Nazi ideology on how the war is carried out, even in the West, even against white European soldiers. They carry out several massacres of French and Belgian civilians in a couple of small towns. For example, Vinct in Belgium or Oigny in France is another example. Of course, they terror bomb the Dutch port of Rotterdam on purpose. They execute surrendered soldiers, well, mostly in terms of the European soldiers, mostly British. For example, at Le Paradis, there's a famous infamous massacre that took place there. The Battle Guide YouTube channel, here's a plug, an in-house plug. The Battle Guide YouTube channel made a great video about the Le Paradis massacre. But the main target are French African troops. And there are about 3,000 of them that the Germans massacre. Not only the SS, but there's even some Wehrmacht units involved in that. So that's a bit of a foreshadowing, something you don't hear that much about when discussing the Western campaign in 1940, but it's a bit of a foreshadowing of how the ideology is already making this war a different one to the First World War. So when Case Red begins now, when we have the Germans, okay, the whole pocket, all the best Allied troops are now gone, essentially. The French try to reorganize along the line of the River Somme. The Maginot Line, by the way, is still intact in the east, but it's just being there. The French know that they're really in a bind. They're really at a disadvantage. The government's in chaos, by the way. We'll focus on the military side of things for this podcast episode, but the Premier, Paul Reynaud, he's bringing in other people. He brings in Charles de Gaulle as a deputy minister. He brings in former World War I hero, General Henri Pétain, as the deputy in the government. This is going to have a big impact because he doesn't believe that France can win. He blames Britain for the war, as do some other nationalistic French politicians. But what the French try to do militarily, I found quite interesting when I was reading about this. They have a new commander, by the way, Weygand. So Gamelin is out, he's too slow. Reynaud appoints Weygand instead, brings him in from Syria, and they develop a defensive system as a last-ditch hope. Still fighting, by the way, everybody out there. I want you to notice that. They're still trying. they develop a hedgehog system in French called hérisson. So what they do is they fortify villages or hills or forests along the front line, and they fortify them for all-round defense. So they understand that the Germans are coming and they're not going to be able to stop penetrations from the German motorized and panzer divisions. The few that the Germans have, since most of their army is still marching on foot or on horse, but those decisive motorized, mechanized divisions, the French understand they're not going to be able to stop them. So what they want to do is hold up the infantry. When the panzers go through, the infantry won't be able to follow and support them and protect their flanks, as you were talking about earlier. And then what remains of Allied armor will be able to attack those German spearheads and hopefully blunt them. That's the plan. As we know, it doesn't really work. Of course, from Paris's point of view, you also don't have that much help from the British. The new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, he does say we're going to send a new BEF. They do send a couple 100,000 men. It's not very well known. They don't see a ton of action. A little bit. There's a counteroffensive near Abbeville where they try to push the Germans back. But then that BEF is also evacuated much more safely than the previous one. But that's a part of the story as well. But the British essentially give up on the French during this period. And some very significant French figures give up on themselves. Pétain being the most famous, but also Pierre Laval, who then becomes a significant figure in the Vichy government. And the collapse is kind of complete. The Germans slice through the French. There is fighting. Some French hedgehogs fight to the death, but it's then over. Churchill proposes that the two states actually unite as one and become one joint Franco-British state, pool all their resources, pool their government, and then France could continue fighting as part of that joint state. But Reynaud, it's too far gone for the French. Reynaud is basically at the end of his strength, at the end of his willpower for all that he had tried, and they give up, right? And that's kind of my very quick summary of what deserves a little more airtime, perhaps in a future episode, of Case Red. Did I miss anything, Matthias, that you wanna get in there on Case Red before we get to the debates and the controversy?
Well, I think the main point, and you mentioned it, is really that everything that happens in Case Red on the Allied side, they are really desperate measures. They're trying to do something. Of course, you don't just surrender when the enemy is standing in your country. You just don't do this. You still got a force. You still got an army. You still got several divisions sitting, manning the Maginot Line. You mentioned it. Even though these are perhaps not the best, the youngest, the fittest troops, but they're there. You still have got other troops that you can use to achieve something. But the problem really is that I think everybody can see, perhaps even before Dunkirk, that once this will happen or has happened, that the game is kind of up. I still remember I have photographs from my grandfather. He was in France in 1940. He was in an anti-aircraft unit. And I still have the photographs from the beaches of Dunkirk with all the left behind material, the vehicles and all this. And on the back, he just wrote, England kaput. I always think, well, if only it didn't happen, but there we go. So at that stage, it was very obvious and clear, but perhaps even before that, because you talked about the political aspect as well. So on the 15th of May, so very early on, so the Germans have just broken through at Sedan. They haven't even reached the Channel yet. On the 15th of May, the French Prime Minister, you mentioned his name, Reynaud, he phones the new British PM, Churchill. And he says to him, well, we have been defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle. And Churchill, and he writes about this, of course, also very good at self-publicizing, because he said, of course, history is going to look on me gently and in a nice way because I intend to write it, the famous phrase. So he flies to Paris on the 16th of May for a meeting. And he says, okay, the situation isn't good, but where are your reserves? To which General Gamelin replies, aucune, which means none. We haven't got any. They're all gone. And Churchill writes about this and says, well, this was the most shocking moment of my entire life. So you can see, even at that stage, very early on, everyone can see the game's up. Again, perhaps returning to my grandfather's story. So once they'd done all the Dunkirk thing, and he was then involved in Case Red as well, because he was an anti-aircraft unit, so slightly behind the front line. He said from that moment onwards, they didn't see any fighting anymore because, as you explained, the French idea, the French concept was slightly different. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's not a very easy walkover for the Germans, but it is relatively obvious that, well, not the game's up, but it's going to be very, very difficult for the French, more or less by themselves at that stage, to win. completely different if the entire British army had deployed. Question, of course, another question perhaps for another session. Would the army have been ready? And what was the state of the British army at that stage? Open bracket, not very good, close bracket. But for the French themselves at that stage, it's difficult.
Yeah, no question. And again, it's difficult because you don't have effective coalition warfare. Like we saw even in 1915, they're more effective at fighting together. Even in 1914, they're more effective at fighting together in the midst of that crisis than they are in 1940. I mean, Churchill, he's a bit of a romantic. He's a bit of a Francophile. He's got a penchant for the dramatic, let's say. He wants to send more troops, and he does send some. As I mentioned, this second BEF that doesn't entirely see action, although some units did, especially the 51st Highland Division. Shout out to them. But most of the British cabinet, most of the British military, they've completely given up on the French at this stage. And there's a great quote from General Alan Brooke when Churchill says he wants to send more help to France, including fighter squadrons that Reynaud was begging for, but that the British wanted to keep home for defensive purposes. Churchill says he wants to give the French the feeling that they're not alone, so that they will keep fighting. And General Alan Brooke says, it's impossible to give a corpse any kind of feeling, and the French army is in fact dead. So yeah, I think that's fairly definitive. You also have some misinterpretations of the nature of Hitler's Germany that I think contributes to the French willingness to accept defeat. General Weygand urges peace at this one meeting with Reynaud. And Reynaud, even though he kind of oversees the collapse and the surrender in a way, or mostly, let's say, he still has fighting spirit. He still sees things clearly. He's just overwhelmed by the events around him. And he tells Weygand, you think that Hitler's like Wilhelm I, the Kaiser of Germany, who took Alsace-Lorraine from France in 1871. But you're wrong. Hitler is Genghis Khan. And I thought, man, okay, that guy knows what he's talking about because he had a much clearer vision. Whereas you have someone like Pétain who accepts the German victory, who sees the British as being responsible for the war, and who sees the French left and French socialist forces as a greater danger than German occupation or German victory over France. And now I think we're bleeding into some of the last segment of our episode here, where we're going to flesh out maybe a few of the debates, a few of the myths about this campaign that we've referred to over the course of the episode. Of course, one of the main ones being, or one of the main debates, let's say, rather than a myth perhaps, is why did the Allies collapse so fast? I think we've mentioned a few of the elements, right? The French are too slow. They're expecting a different kind of fighting. They're not able to react. They're not able to coordinate with the British, and the British are not able to coordinate with the French as well. And so the Germans, on the other hand, their risk comes off. They're able to concentrate the armor and use it as one fast-moving fist that just tips the balance, essentially.
When you look at the Allied collapse, I think you need to look at it from different points of view and analyze different areas. So the first one is the political. You already talked a lot about the political situation in France. And very often the political situation in France is taken as the main reason as to why France itself as a country collapses. Because you've got all these different factions. You've got a very strong left. You've got the right, you talked about it. You've got the conservative idea, the idea of the two Frances, which still exists today. So the more progressive left-leaning in the cities, the more rural conservative one. To me personally, that is too easy. Because let's face it, when your own country is being invaded, you normally put these factions, these controversies to one side, you unite and you fight the invader. The exception to this perhaps were the communists, because they were told by Stalin, the Comintern, not to take up arms against the Germans. Simply, that's not how he expressed this, but because Germany was allied with the Soviet Union at that time. So there's a little bit of that. But on the whole, I think there are other reasons, and most of them probably are military. We already talked about the tactical performance of the French army, which was actually, just to re-emphasize that point, much better than what we give it credit for. But it's more at the operational and the strategic level. And that we talked about the slowness and not being able to adapt, constantly being outmaneuvered, outthought by the Germans, the famous term, the OODA loop, which is a term that's still being used in military training today. So the Germans constantly outmaneuver the French. And when you look at, for example, Marc Bloch, we talked about him in a previous episode, and when he writes about strange defeat, he says that one of the main reasons for the French collapse was actually the slow progress in the general's thinking. And he linked that and compared that to the First World War. He had fought in the First World War, most of the time not as an officer, but as an NCO. And so his experience, having fought most of the big battles, again, was this whole idea of people led to the slaughter by incompetent generals. And he says, well, we see exactly the same thing here again. So I think this is probably the most important aspect that we find.
Yeah, I think Marc Bloch, I have a quote from him actually from Strange Defeat. As I mentioned in a previous episode, he's one of my all-time favorite historians, superhero historian, if you will, because he enters the French resistance after their defeat, and eventually he's caught and killed by the Germans. But he writes this amazing book, investigating, exploring, thinking about the reasons for this strange defeat, as he calls it. And he sums it up basically this way. He says, whatever the deep-seated causes of the disaster may have been, so that's the political, the ideological, the cultural stuff, the immediate occasion was the utter incompetence of the high command. So that essentially just kind of encapsulates the point that you also made. I do think, though, just for the sake of argument, that there is a morale aspect there. I mean, you could have had better command decisions and still had some troubles with morale that might have had a bigger impact or a negative impact on the outcome of the campaign. I came across a passage in an American magazine, in Life magazine in 1940. And I think there's something to this because, as you mentioned, you have the communists who are not particularly enthusiastic on the left. And you have the fascist French movement, the Action Française, which is quite influential, especially in higher military circles, that also has some ideological hesitations about continuing the war to the bitter end or joining forces with left-wing Frenchmen to resist the Germans and so on. And this Life magazine article says, if the French had not lost faith in democracy, they had certainly lost faith in the kind of democratic system and the kind of politicians that France had. So I do think there is something to that. But yes, I would agree that I think the decisive factor would be the performance of the French high command and the inability for Britain and France to coordinate their actions effectively. To me, that's where the rubber sort of meets the road. And the other myth I think that I wanted to discuss a little bit was in the few minutes that we have remaining here, that the French didn't fight. You hear this all the time, right? And of course, you hear some Frenchmen saying that the British didn't fight, which might come as a surprise to some of our British listeners, and that they just ran to Dunkirk and left the French on their own, which is, of course, not a fair assessment. It's also not a fair assessment to say that the French didn't fight, which you hear in the English-speaking world, but you also hear very much in the Russian-speaking world, that none of the Western Europeans fought. They suffered 60,000 dead in 6 weeks. Now, you don't suffer 60,000 dead in 6 weeks if you're not fighting. Of course, that's smaller numbers than later campaigns, than in the East and so on, but they were fighting. We can assess the issues with that, but they were fighting.
Absolutely. They were fighting. They were dying. You've just given the number. They were just fighting in a very inefficient way. I think that's one of the problems. Coming back to this concept of fighting power, where you have the moral component, we talked about the factor of morale, both at the strategic level, the political level, but also at the pure military level. The physical, we talked about this, they've got more men, but then it's the conceptual level as well. And here they really have an issue because they don't do what the Germans do. So bring all their troops together, create some sort of iron fist, but they spread out, for example, their tanks. The tanks are mainly used in an infantry support role, and that makes it possible for the Germans to create superiority at the Schwerpunkt, the point of main effort. And that is, from a pure military perspective, again, is perhaps one of the most tragic events or tragic facts that you find on the French side. And give another quote, when you look at Saint-Exupéry, who probably most people know because he wrote The Petit Prince, he, of course, was a pilot. And he flew in a recce unit. He then dies, is basically when goes missing in action over the over the Mediterranean Sea later on at a later stage. But talking about this, talking about his experience during this particular campaign, which he then wrote up and published, and that's called in French Pilote de Guerre, and in English it's called Flight to Arras. And in there's a quote where he says, well, so we're doing all this and we're fighting as we're told, but he says, the crews are being sacrificed like glasses of water thrown onto a forest fire. I think that sums it up quite nicely. So this whole idea of not being able to combine all your forces and to use them where it really matters. So they basically, sounds awful, but they waste all the manpower. And that, of course, means all the casualties that you just mentioned were eventually in vain.
Indeed. The other great myth about the Dunkirk pause and the stop, did Hitler, as he said, really want to save the British Expeditionary Force for another day in order to get better peace terms with England? Folks, we're going to save that for another episode in the future because we're out of time for today. But there you have it. That's our take on the Western campaign in 1940. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? What did we leave out? What do you want to see in a future episode where we revisit some part of this in more detail, go more hardcore on some part of it? Let us know, and thanks for listening. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.